Our next speaker is John Conklin, who has designed sets and costumes for major American opera houses, including New York City Opera, the Opera Theater of St. Louis, Glimmerglass, and the opera companies of Dallas, Houston, Minneapolis, Washington, and a long list of others, including Boston. He has designed a program, he has produced, I don't know, produced or designed? He's done the productions for Fanciulla several times, and we're very lucky to have him today. He's also artistic advisor to the Boston Lyric Opera. So let's please welcome John Conklin.
Thank you. I would like to start by just repeating two famous quotes. One was Richard Wagner's quote on Meyerbeer, "effects without cause." And one is Diaghilev's request to Jean Cocteau in 1917, "astonish me." This seems to be perhaps two sides of the Belasco Puccini question. Belasco was obviously a very famous, well-known producer on Broadway. He also wrote plays, he acted in plays, he designed plays. He was known as the Great Wizard, or after he was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, Monsieur Belasco, the Great White Father. He had a shock of white hair. The genius of the stage, Saint David, the Bishop of Broadway, because not only with his white hair, he had a white collar, clerical collar, and he dressed all in black. So what do these titles tell us about him? Wizard, magician. To a certain extent, obviously, they're honorary. To a certain extent, they have a tinge of irony about them. And also, they have a tinge of what I would call a certain sense of illusion or even a charlatanism. The Wizard of Oz. A celebration of his power of illusion to create worlds rather than a depth of perception. This is also tied in with his obsession and great success with the technical aspects of the theater in terms of stage machinery, of miraculous transformations on stage, lighting, and so on. And his connection with the ambiguous and often disturbing word melodrama. He was, as I said, rich, famous, immensely powerful at the height of his career, but he is remembered now mostly through his connection with Puccini and with The Girl of the Golden West and Madama Butterfly. And this celebration of the premiere of Fanciulla perhaps brings him back into the limelight, where he would have been how he would have been immensely pleased by that. Many of the impulses he sought out and created are, for better or for worse, enduring in our theater. They're controversial, and they are revelatory of the desires of the public, whatever that means, and the enduring desires of perhaps all of us. And just some examples that come to mind. Going on in New York now, trying to open, is a extremely elaborate production, technically elaborate production, musical production of Spider-Man, directed by Julie Taymor. It is a production whose technical aspects have taken over the entire space of the theater and have taken over, it seems, the entire production. And can this be traced, if not directly back to Belasco, directly back to the ideas that Belasco had? Near the end of his career, he actually, in the theater that he still called the Belasco, did a production in which he also tore out the whole inside of the theater and created this, as it was called, a hell machine. The orchestra pit was covered, and the proscenium arch virtually dismantled. The boxes and balconies were sheathed in metal, and on stage, the great psycho-corruptor, which was the machine that was in the play, was compounded of steel plate, boilers, engines, rivets, bolts, trestles, pinions, gears, flywheels, ladders, sliding metal doors, towers, turrets, and switches. The interior of the Belasco Theater resembled the engine room of a battleship. When the production was finally assembled, the stage manager found himself with a prompt script containing 1,500 technical cues, or approximately 8 per minute during the 3-hour show. This is being enacted again on Broadway. Across town at the Metropolitan, another large machine has been entered into the theater, a machine that for the ring cycle and has been operated for Rheingold and will be for Valkyrie at the end of the season. Here is another example where a technical device has, to a certain extent, devoured the production, devoured the music, has become the defining event. And, like Spider-Man, which at its first preview stranded Spider-Man over the audience during the intermission, the stagehands had to come out and pull him down. This machine at the Met has not functioned perfectly. So how is this something where the desire for effect, the desire for a gasp, the desire for astonishment has superseded other values connected with a stage production? And I think it is significant that this machine has replaced, much to some people's considerable disappointment and annoyance, a production of The Ring, the Schneider-Simpson production of The Ring, which could be said to be deliberately a descendant of Belasco realism, what I call wall-to-wall scenery, representative of the specifics of time and place in The Ring, all of which is completely discarded, to the most part, in at least the Rheingold that the Met is doing now. We have another example in the replacement of the Zeffirelli Tosca by a Luca Bondi production, which again takes away, not to the degree that the Rheingold does, but takes away the specificity, the Belasco-like specificity of the Zeffirelli Tosca, where the curtain went up, you saw the Castle Sant'Angelo. You saw the Sant'Andrea della Valle church reproduced on stage. Belasco was famous for this kind of realistic developments on stage. At one point, for a play, he produced the last scene took place in a child's restaurant in New York, which was completely reproduced on stage, complete with cooking and with food served to the audience. He was also, at one point, supposedly ripped a room out of a space, a flop house, and presented it on stage. So why? Well, no, I wanted to tell you a sort of counter story to that. I was at the new production of Boris Godunov, and the house lights went completely down, the orchestra lights went down, theater was in darkness and silent. The curtain went up in silence. Gergiev sort of snuck into the pit, so we had no sense of him or the orchestra. And the curtain went up, and there was basically an empty stage with one character strongly lit, center stage, still in silence. And the man next to me said, without taking a breath, he said, "Oh God, it's an idea production." Now, I don't know exactly, I didn't know what to make of that, but the conflict that is still existing certainly the battle is being still fought in the aesthetics of opera, in the aesthetics of opera production, and it is, I think, still a battlefield of real significance for opera as to how it is being led. And the Met is and Peter Gelb has made a deliberate attention to lead the Metropolitan, and therefore to lead the opera world in America away from Zeffirelli and away from Belasco, and towards a more abstract representation. I think it is interesting, and I'm a designer, and I myself am caught in this struggle for the soul of the audience, as to what is a direction that connects to an audience. Why were the old Ring sets and Zeffirelli's Tosca, and the same thing is going to happen because they are introducing a new, very stripped-down, minimalist production of Traviata in the spring, the Met, to replace the Zeffirelli Traviata. What is it that draws us to this world of what I call a Belasco Zeffirelli production? Partially it is, and I think that this was something that that Belasco realized. We love to see, there is a certain interest and a certain magic about things on stage, as opposed to seeing them in real life or seeing them in the movies. For instance, famously, Belasco in Girl of the Golden West in the second act had an extremely realistically conceived snowstorm that happened outside Minnie's cabin. And it was, interestingly enough, created by an offstage orchestra, as it were, of stage technicians, 32 of them. There was a conductor who conducted the effect almost as an offstage orchestra. Well, I mean, we've all been in snowstorms, right? We have all seen snowstorms can be more realistically done in the movies. But when we see it on stage, somehow the technique of it and the magic of becomes rather magical. In the same way we can go to Sant Andrea della Valle, we can see Sant Andrea della Valle in the DVD of Tosca that was filmed there in the church. But when we see it reproduced on stage, it becomes something else. It isn't, I think, just a kind of familiarity. There is an admiration of technique and an admiration of skill that can bring that to us. Everything is magnified. And to a certain sense, the tricks are made manifest, even though they're hidden, they're isolated, and they're made human. There is I don't know whether you're familiar with Bregenz, which is an outdoor festival in Austria that does these gigantic productions outside. And there is a DVD of Trovatore, I don't know whether you've seen that, which the entire opera is played in and around a full-scale replica of an oil refinery. It seems to me the ultimate in Belascoism, full-scale, realistic. Smoke, automobiles drive on it, and so on. But to me, what is interesting about Bregenz is also that that production and other productions there were directed and are directed by leading contemporary opera directors. There is and they are drawn to the kind of circus-like, even the huge scale and the kind of circus-like world that place represents, and that somehow opera seems pulled in two directions. It seems to be pulled to be intimate, and it is pulled to be huge, even out of scale, or out of even theatrical scale. So I think one thing is that another factor that is in this whole business of where opera is going is this question of the HD broadcasts, which has been referred to earlier in these sessions. Is that going to be the future of opera, in which close-ups basically dominate the force? And in close-ups, and with close-ups, you need to have a kind of Belasco approach towards scenery, towards props, and, as has been pointed out, perhaps towards singers. Singers will be, the theory is that singers will be cast for their looks in close-up, not to be seen at a distance. And the HD broadcasts are, of course, enormously popular. So is this, again, a kind of manifestation of what realism is and what Belasco was saying realism is? I mean, I have done productions in which I was told that the background was too empty and too abstract. It wouldn't look good in a close-up or in an in-shot. So is that what directors, designers are going to be asked to do? And the question of the shots, of the way the camera moves, who it is focusing on, as you said, what is the narrative that the camera angles are telling, which is quite edited, which is quite different than what an audience sees the whole picture. And I wonder again if directors are going to be starting to be chosen with their skills in camera shots, in their skills in storyboarding, to make an effective HD and a DVD that follows it, rather than in the house. And at my worst fear, I can see the Metropolitan, I exaggerate, but closing its doors to performances and turning into the most advanced and the most glittery television producing studio in the world. I don't think that will happen, but you never know. The idea of melodrama is an interesting, wait a minute, let me go back. To talk a little bit more about Belasco and his stage excitement. It's been referred to that he, at the beginning of Girl of the Golden West, he had actually was a moving diorama that showed the journey from the mountains to Minnie's cabin down to the polka saloon. And then it dissolved into the first thing. So he was, because this was, as 1905 was Girl of the Belasco, Girl of the Golden West was the beginning of movies, the beginning of film. So what he was doing was actually taking as it were, a sort of panning shot, an establishing panning shot, and moving it down. And then what Puccini did was to write, as has been discussed, the short introduction overture, and then which in a way is a sort of a musical panning shot of the thing, and then we focus in on the polka. Just parenthetically, going back to this business of HD and what would you do if you needed to fill in that moment, as has been even before HD, directors and designers filled in those moments with pantomime. Now what happens is that often you see the conductor and you see the orchestra playing the introduction or the overture. And what does that do? Because that is, of course, completely different than sitting in the house and looking at something and hearing the music. You are being steered by the conductor, the movements of the conductor, by seeing the instruments being played. It is despicable when it's used as titles. That is seems to me anathema, but it is curious that now people are listening to orchestral interludes or whatever in a different way by seeing the conductor and by seeing the instruments that are playing. And how does that change? How does that change our perception of the music rather than simply sitting in a dark theater and hearing it come up to us from a more or less hidden source? One of Belasco's most famous effects, and an effect that intrigued Puccini when he saw it and led Puccini to seek out Belasco and Butterfly, was a very famous sequence that happened, the passage of time between the two scenes of the one-act play. It was the passage of time was realized without the traditional lowering of the curtain. In the fading twilight, Butterfly, her child and servant Suzuki, took their station at the window to await the imminent return of Pinkerton, whose warship had been steaming into the harbor below. Night fell. Stars appeared, and the lanterns of celebration, lit by Butterfly, flickered out one by one until finally the scene was enveloped in darkness. Gradually, in the gray light of dawn, the audience could make out the lonely figure of the faithful Butterfly still at the window. And finally, the prostrate forms of Suzuki and Little Trouble huddled in sleep at her feet. The rosy glow of sunrise filled the room, and birds trilled their morning song from the cherry trees blooming outside in the garden. Belasco's stimulated night lasted 14 minutes, and was so adroit was this technical tour de force that an awestruck audience scarcely dared move or breathe during the transitions. I myself find it hard to believe that it was really as long as 14 minutes. Whether you could sustain, the whole second act of Bohème is only 20 minutes. Whether you could sustain 14 minutes without 14 minutes of a light cue, which is essentially what he's saying is an enormous amount of time. But this was the kind of where the realism of Belasco became a poetic character in the play. And this was adapted by Puccini, and of course it's part of the different editions of Butterfly, whether you do runs Act 2 and 3 together and do that transition. And that is always a very controversial staging question as to whether it will sustain. And here we're told that it's sustained without music, just with lights and sound. As I said, one of his famous effects in Girl was the snowstorm. Belasco lived an extremely colorful life. He had been as a child and a young man in the California Gold Rush era place, and he famously wrote about the incident of the blood, the drip of blood, which was by some people considered melodramatic and unplausible in a melodramatic way. But he says, it was from my father that I first got the idea, which afterwards so well served me in Girl, the Incident of the Sheriff. And so he tells about an incident where a man was wounded. He staggered in. He asked for help. He climbed up to hide. The sheriff was coming. He climbed up to hide. And he says, the sheriff, a blanched face looked down through the rafters. A hand clutched nervously at a shirt, now deep stained in red. The sheriff gazed at the telltale spot on his arms and smiled cynically, as one can afford to do who is the master of such a situation. Did you fellows know he was up there? He asked, taking his gun from his pocket. There was nothing to be said. The facts were against it. The victim was caught. There was no staying the hand of the law. No one could see this very well as the sheriff gripped his gun and drew himself up to his full height. Standing there, his gaunt shadow thrown against the wall, his white face etched deep with the marks of hardship and toil, he poked the muzzle of his gun between the rafters and fired. He had done his job, and so he left without another word. An interesting other conclusion to that scene. I'm sorry. Organize myself here. In Girl, in Fanciulla, Puccini actually sort of out-Belasco'd Belasco. He wrote the third act, which is set in the dance hall part of the polka saloon, the third act doesn't appeal to me much. But I think it would be possible to arrange it if one takes three things into account. The scene where he is brought on bound. I should make the scene of his sentence and the insults of the sheriff take place then. So no school episode. She moved to the first act. Then she arrives, surprised, and there is a big scene in which she pleads for his freedom, everybody being against her except Nick. He wanted to replace the final act with something that makes people say from sheer amazement, bravo, by God. The original play ends with, as was discussed, the scene where he is saved. He gets to go out with Minnie and Johnson leaving the miners and Rance behind. And then there is an odd little short in the play, Act 4, which is set not in the mountains, but the boundless prairies of the West, on the way east at the dawn of a day about a week later. And it is just a little short scene between Johnson and the girl. They are going east. They are retreating, as it were, from the Sierras, from the West, and going back to, and she says still, oh, my California, I'm leaving you, oh, my lovely West. But it is a sort of a quiet ending as opposed to the somewhat more grandiose opera ending. And even in a way more interesting is his end of the first act, where it ends with, again, the girl saying, he says, I have the face of an angel. And then instead of the wonderful Puccini sigh from her and the orchestra, I have the face of an angel. She turns her face away and says, oh, hell. Curtain. Okay, thank you.